Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Brian Foster was never a man for big surprises. At 45, he lived methodically, woke up at 6:15 without needing an alarm, fed his Labrador Toby before making his own coffee, and read the printed newspaper while watching the sunrise from the varnished wooden porch overlooking the garden. Working as a regional sales manager in the agricultural sector wasn't thrilling, but it offered stability, and that was enough. Vanessa, his wife of 12 years, said she admired him for that, for being reliable, steady, someone who didn't get lost in the world's ups and downs. But lately, he'd noticed that this steadiness seemed to be boring Vanessa. It was subtle. She still smiled, still kissed him goodbye before heading off to work as a holistic therapist, still posted photos of the two of them on social media, but there was a certain distance in her eyes. A slight delay in affection. Text messages had grown shorter. Weekends, once filled with walks in the park or marathons of old TV shows, were now occupied with retreats, energy alignment sessions, and meetings with clients going through major inner awakenings. Brian wasn't foolish, but he also wasn't the paranoid type. It took him a while to admit he felt an uncomfortable pang in his chest every time she mentioned Tyler's name. Always Tyler. The sensitive friend, the emotional guide, the spiritual mentor. They'd met him together 2 years earlier at a conscious breathing workshop in Asheville. Brian had only gone to please Vanessa, but Tyler dove right in. Since then, he'd become a frequent presence in her conversations. At first, it seemed like mere admiration. Then, it became too much admiration. Lately, something more intimate crept into every reference. Tyler told me something that made me think of you, or Tyler is helping us grow as a couple, even without realizing it. But Brian didn't expect Vanessa to take the next step so directly. It was their wedding anniversary. 12 years. He'd prepared a simple dinner at home, fresh pasta, red wine, fireplace lit. Toby slept at the foot of the couch. And that's when she put down her fork, looked into his eyes with rehearsed gentleness, and said, "Brian, what would you think if we invited Tyler to spend a weekend with us at the lake house?" The question hung in the air for seconds that felt far too long. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her face, searching for what remained of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Vanessa smiled sweetly, as if proposing something trivial. Maybe, in her mind, it really was. "Are you serious?" Brian finally asked, his voice dry, the kind she hadn't heard in a long time. Vanessa nodded slowly, as if this were a gesture of marital maturity. "It would be good for us. He's someone who helps us grow emotionally. I feel his presence could open new possibilities for us." Brian laughed. Not from humor. He laughed nervously, incredulously. But only inwardly. Outwardly, he remained calm. He toasted to the proposal. Gently clinked his glass against hers. "Sure," he replied. "Why not?" That night, lying beside her, he'd already made a decision. There were no more doubts, only a plan quietly forming. If she wanted to test the limits of their marriage, he'd show her he knew how to play too, just smarter. The following week, Vanessa busied herself preparing for the weekend at the lake house, a property inherited from Brian's father, nestled in a wooded area near Lake Lure, North Carolina. It was her favorite place. There, she said, the energy flowed better. She picked out wines, incense, meditation mats. She set aside tantra books, curated playlists with Tibetan singing bowls, and bought a new white linen dress. Meanwhile, Brian arranged for preventative maintenance on the house. They changed locks, tested the heater, cleaned the air conditioner filters. And discreetly, he called someone he hadn't seen in months, Laura Spencer, a childhood friend who'd become a lawyer in Atlanta. Brian didn't explain everything. He just said he needed her presence that weekend, and if she agreed, he'd cover her travel, gas, and even cook her favorite pasta. Laura laughed and said yes. But warned, If this turns into one of those stories that end in marital disaster, give me a heads up first. Brian simply replied, I don't know the ending yet. But I promise it'll be unforgettable. On the drive to the lake, Vanessa was lighter than ever. She laughed for no reason, hummed old songs, held his hand in the car. She spoke as if everything were perfectly balanced. To her, inviting Tyler was just a consequence of the couple's emotional evolution. Brian just smiled, driving in silence, eyes fixed on the road, heart numb. When they arrived, Vanessa stepped out of the car enthusiastically, commenting on the scent of the grass and the perfect temperature for a morning swim. But her expression completely changed when she saw Laura appear on the porch, wine glass in hand, smiling calmly. Laura? Vanessa asked, her voice suddenly low. Surprise, Brian said, grabbing the suitcases. I thought it'd be nice to have someone special with us this weekend. Don't you think? Vanessa's response stuck in her throat. And there, in that awkward pause, the first irreparable crack opened. Vanessa didn't hide her discomfort. Laura, sitting in a lounge chair near the porch, seemed perfectly at ease, as if she'd been part of the weekend from the start. Brian watched everything silently, almost impassively, but inside, he studied every gesture of his wife with precision. Vanessa smiled politely, but her gaze drifted between Brian's face and Laura's wine glass, as if she didn't understand what was happening, or, worse, as if she was about to lose control over something she thought was secure. I just don't really understand, you said we'd be spending time alone, Vanessa murmured as soon as Brian walked into the house with the suitcases. And we will, he replied calmly. Laura's only staying until tomorrow morning. She has commitments in Atlanta. But I thought it'd be nice to have company. It's been a while since we caught up with her, right? Vanessa nodded slowly. She was too surprised to argue then. She couldn't accuse Brian of anything, he was just doing what she'd suggested, inviting someone. That night, dinner was uncomfortable. Laura spoke naturally, laughing at old stories, reminiscing about past trips and parties. Brian participated in the conversation with grace and attention. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed restless, disconnected, lost in thought. She kept checking her phone, as if expecting a message, a call, some signal to pull her out of an environment that suddenly no longer felt like her territory. The next morning, Laura thanked them for their hospitality and left, leaving behind an atmosphere saturated with tension. Minutes later, Vanessa packed her bags and announced she needed to return to the city. Said she had a headache, maybe had overdone it with the wine, wasn't in sync with the place. Brian didn't insist. He just watched her leave in a hurry, leaving behind the linen dress still hanging on the closet door. As soon as she disappeared down the road, Brian called a number he'd discreetly saved days earlier. The private detective's name was Carson Blake. He was experienced, discreet, and offered almost surgical service, delivering proof without leaving traces. Within an hour, he was already in motion, ready to follow Vanessa's steps. That same day, by late afternoon, Brian received the first images. Vanessa had checked into a boutique hotel in Charlotte. But she wasn't alone. Tyler arrived shortly after, wearing a cap and sunglasses, as if fleeing something. They were seen together in the hotel restaurant, then walking hand in hand through an art gallery, and finally entering her room. The images left no doubt. They were more than just spiritual friends. Brian wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes. But not surprised. It only confirmed that the bond between them had broken long before that night with wine and fireplace. But more than sadness, what he felt was icy clarity. He didn't want revenge out of anger. He wanted justice out of dignity. And above all, he wanted Vanessa to face the consequences of her choices in the most impactful way possible, in front of her own mother. Vanessa returned home late that night, avoiding explanations. Dinner had already gone cold on the table, and Brian waited for her, seated, expressionless. They spoke only the basics, short, functional words, like two strangers sharing the same roof. No mention of Charlotte. No justification. And, to his surprise, no questioning about Laura's presence at the lake house. It was as if Vanessa preferred clinging to silence rather than facing the truth. The next day, Brian planned everything with precision. He printed the photos on high-quality matte paper. Not to spread online, not to publicly humiliate. Just enough so there'd be no denying it. He tucked some inside Vanessa's meditation books, others in the picture frames in the living room, others under sofa cushions. He created a silent trail of truths hidden in plain sight. Then, he called Margaret, his mother-in-law. He said he'd like to host her for a special dinner. She was an elegant woman, with measured speech and impeccable posture. She'd always been fond of Brian, whom she called a man of integrity, nearly extinct. She accepted enthusiastically. Vanessa, upon learning of the invitation, was unsettled. But Brian acted as if nothing was wrong. On the afternoon of the dinner, Vanessa arrived early to help with preparations. She was visibly nervous. Asked if everything was okay between them. Brian said yes, and that she looked beautiful. That left her even more unsettled. When he mentioned he'd invited her mother to join them for dinner, Vanessa found the gesture strange, as if it made no sense to include Margaret in a night that, until then, seemed meant only for the couple. She questioned him with a suspicious look, but faced with Brian's calmness and the justification that it'd be good for everyone to be together, she eventually accepted, albeit hesitantly. Margaret arrived promptly at 7. She wore navy blue and brought an apple pie. She hugged Brian affectionately and greeted her daughter tenderly. They sat at the table and began chatting about trivialities, the weather, local politics, Vanessa's new project with patients seeking inner healing. That's when Margaret picked up the napkin in front of her. As she unfolded it, she found a photo. Vanessa and Tyler, laughing, holding hands. Brian pretended not to notice. Margaret fell silent, but her eyes slowly scanned the image. She picked up another, under the flower vase in the center of the table. Then another, beneath her wine glass. The silence grew heavy. Vanessa tried to take the photos from her mother's hands, but Margaret pulled away firmly. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vanessa didn't know how to respond. Brian then stood up and said calmly, "You don't need to see any more of this. I'll call a car to take you home. I'm sorry for involving you in this, but I thought you deserved to know who your daughter has become." Margaret lowered her head. She didn't argue. She picked up her purse, stared at her daughter with deep disappointment, and left without saying another word. Vanessa stood frozen. She didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just breathed quickly, as if struggling to keep control. Brian, standing, simply said, "Now it's just the two of us." And there, in that tense silence, the storm that had been contained began to form. Vanessa stood in the middle of the living room, as if time had frozen around her. The photos were now scattered everywhere, not just to be seen, but to be felt. Each image's presence was like a voice screaming what she'd tried to hide for months. Brian walked slowly, silently, gathering the glasses from the table and taking them to the sink. His calmness seemed more threatening than if he'd been shouting. She approached slowly, her face tense, eyes restless. "You planned all of this?" "I did," he replied, still turned away. "You gave me the reason, I just gave it structure. You called my mother to see that? What kind of man does that?" Brian slowly turned and looked her straight in the eyes. The kind of man who was humiliated without raising his voice. The kind of man who sat beside his wife while she asked to bring her lover, disguised as a friend, to spend a weekend in the house inherited from his father. The kind of man who got tired of being made a fool while pretending everything was normal. Vanessa crossed her arms, trying to maintain some posture. "That doesn't justify what you did to my mother. And what you did to me justifies what, exactly?" Brian interrupted, his voice firm, not raising his tone, but with words sharp as a razor. You wanted me to make space in my marriage for another man. You wanted me to invite the guy who touched you behind my back to share the fireplace with us. And you expected me to say what? Sure, honey, grab 2 pillows. Let's all sleep in the same bed. Vanessa lowered her eyes for a moment, then tried to explain. I was confused. I thought we could try something different. You've been so distant the last few months. Distant? He laughed, without humor. I was busy trying to hold together a marriage where only one of us was actually present. You replaced me with coded messages, energetic meetings, hidden touches at retreats I didn't even know you attended. You wanted something different? You got it. You just didn't expect the difference to come from me, did you? She walked to the sofa and sat down, pressing her temples with her fingers. I made a mistake. Okay? I messed up. But you set this all up like it was a dirty game. Brian slowly approached, stopping in front of her. This wasn't a game. This was the only way for you to see what you refused to admit. You didn't fall into a trap, Vanessa. You built every step of it with your choices. She then stood up angrily. What do you want now? For me to leave? To beg for forgiveness? No, he replied dryly. I want you to own it. No detours. No justifications. Say it plainly, I cheated on my husband. She hesitated, looked at the floor, then at him. And for the first time, without defense or argument, she simply said. I cheated on you. The silence afterward was crushing. It was the sound of something breaking completely. There were no more masks. No more fantasies. Only what remained, a dead love, a devastated man, and a woman who only then seemed to understand the depth of the abyss she'd dug. Brian walked to the office, picked up a blue folder, and returned. He handed it to her firmly. Here's the initial document. I spoke with my lawyer this morning. He's already filed for divorce and prepared a draft outlining how the separation will proceed. I don't want to be your husband anymore, Vanessa. And you don't want to be my wife anymore. You just didn't have the courage to admit it. She opened the folder with trembling hands. Skimmed the terms and frowned. You're keeping the house, and the lake house too. Both were inherited by me. They've been in my name since before we married. My lawyer just reinforced the protective clauses in the will. You knew that. You just thought it'd never be necessary. Vanessa slammed the folder shut. This is cruel. No, he replied. Cruel was you destroying a 12-year story because of an inflated ego disguised as self-discovery. Cruel was leaving me talking to myself night after night, pretending to be at retreats while meeting another man in hotels. Cruel was looking me in the eyes, pretending love, while trying to turn me into a fool, wanting to bring your lover into our life as if it were something natural. She walked to the door, stopped, and looked back, eyes watery. Do you still love me? The question hung in the air for a second. Brian took a deep breath, lowered his eyes, and answered with brutal honesty. I still love the idea of who you used to be. But the woman standing in front of me now, I don't recognize anymore. He then took a deep breath, looked straight at her, and added, Pack your things, Vanessa. This is my house, and you don't belong here anymore. She left. Didn't slam the door. Just disappeared into the dark hallway, like a ghost who'd finally accepted she no longer had space in that house. And Brian, for the first time in months, sat on the sofa with Toby beside him, closed his eyes, and breathed in peace. The days that followed were filled with absolute silence in the house Brian now occupied alone. The space felt larger, colder, but paradoxically more truthful. There were no more disguises, no empty conversations, no spiritual explanations used to cover secret meetings. For the first time in a long time, solitude didn't weigh on him like a condemnation, but like liberation. Vanessa, on the other hand, quickly discovered the weight of her choices. She left the house with only 2 suitcases, temporarily staying in a small rented apartment in Charlotte. She tried contacting Tyler, but found only silence. He, who spoke so much about soul connections and shared growth, vanished when the situation demanded more than hidden encounters. He disappeared from social media, blocked her number, and never showed up at the same spiritual retreats again. To Tyler, Vanessa had been just a convenient chapter in his life of fleeting affairs. Without a husband, lover, or home, Vanessa had to live much more modestly. Many clients from her holistic therapy clinic began distancing themselves as discreet rumors surfaced about her separation. Not because they judged her personal life, but because they noticed in her a look of disorder that contrasted with the image of balance she'd always preached. She tried to deny it, tried to rebuild her image, but deep down, she knew her mother's disappointed gaze was the worst consequence of all. Margaret never again spoke to her with the same affection. Whenever they met, there was distance, an impassable barrier of disappointment. Brian, meanwhile, took a different path. In the first months after the divorce, he threw himself into work, but realized it wasn't enough. He then decided to turn his pain into something useful. Inspired by his experience, he began giving talks at local gatherings for men going through traumatic divorces. He didn't speak of revenge or bitterness, but of clarity, how to recognize signs, act with dignity, and not let betrayal define your identity. Laura, the childhood friend who'd served as a strategic piece in his plan, returned to her routine in Atlanta but kept in touch with him. She was the first person to show him that true friendship doesn't vanish in the face of crisis. Over time, their relationship gained new meaning. There was no rush or romanticization, just sincere companionship that grew naturally. Brian wasn't trying to replace Vanessa, but to rediscover that it was still possible to trust someone. Meanwhile, Vanessa insisted on trying to reverse the legal process, believing she still had a right to part of the properties. Her lawyer, however, confirmed what Brian already knew: the assets were protected by inheritance clauses, and she had no claim. All that remained for her were personal belongings and furniture, which she collected silently months later, avoiding eye contact with her ex-husband. When she left the lake house for the last time to pick up some paintings and clothes, Toby barked non-stop. Vanessa tried to pet the dog, but he pulled away and ran back to Brian's feet. To her, it felt as if even the smallest bonds had broken. Gradually, the town forgot the scandal. The couple's social circle moved on, but the marks remained. When someone mentioned Vanessa's name, it was with a look of silent compassion. Brian, increasingly, was seen as an example of resilience and emotional intelligence. He hadn't shouted, hadn't turned violent, hadn't stooped low. He simply showed the truth and moved forward. The unexpected came months later in a chance encounter. Brian was at a cafe in Asheville when he saw Vanessa hurrying in. She didn't see him immediately, but when she did, she froze for a few seconds. She walked up to him and said, "I never imagined you'd be capable of doing to me what you did." Brian closed his newspaper and replied calmly, "I also never imagined you'd be capable of doing to me what you did. We're even." She lowered her eyes, muttered something unintelligible, and left. It was their last meeting. Time passed. Brian learned to enjoy the silence of the house, the quiet mornings with Toby, the nights reading books without wondering where his wife really was. He rediscovered peace. Vanessa moved forward more discreetly but never regained the same image or trust she once had. From then on, she carried the shadow of her own choices. The lover continued his life as if nothing had happened. Tyler moved to another city, kept attending meditation groups and retreats, but always kept his distance from Vanessa. To him, it had just been another episode in a long history of superficial entanglements. And so, the story reached its logical end, but not without the poetic irony of someone who believed they controlled the threads of life, only to discover the strings were being pulled from the other side. Brian didn't win because he destroyed his wife, he won because he didn't let her destruction drag him down too. Sometimes, life doesn't pay back in the same coin. It pays back with something far more powerful: freedom. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.